Cool. Well, Oliver, thank you so much for joining us on the debrief today. I'm really looking forward to the conversation that we're about to have. So, just to give people a little bit more context, a few weeks ago, a few months ago at this point, we had a conversation or we had a debrief episode where we spoke about sort of scaling your company at the various stages. So, from those early days to sort of that middle phase where you've been around for a few years to that more mature phase. Today, we're going to be talking about scaling past that sort of more mature stage and like all of the unknowns that brings and how to scale past that point. But before we do that, I'd love to hear about you and your background. So tell me a bit about yourself and how you ended up at Eagle Eye.
Sure. So I started coding when I was 8 years old. I loved the idea of computers doing things that you told it to do. And I think since then, it's all kind of snowballed after getting myself behind a laptop or behind a computer and just getting everything in my head out onto, I think it was Notepad at the time, and seeing what you could do. Since then, I've been building things. I came from an agency background, building websites, learned more about APIs, learned more about backends. And I really like the idea of kind of creating things that would change the world as such, as in being a part of what it is that other people are doing, being part of kind of the global infrastructure that makes things work. Thinking about like going on a train, going on a plane, buying something from a shop. If you look around, all of that involves some sort of automation or coding or something in that area. So to be a part of that is really interesting to me. So I actually started contracting for a little while. And when I was doing that, I think I was kind of heavily involved in APIs and trying to work out what I wanted to do. I think I worked for a company that did the behind the scenes of Rightmove, and that was quite cool because you could kind of see in real life what was really going on when people were looking at properties. And I then came across Eagle Eye, and I thought, oh, okay, this is kind of cool. No one really knows who they are, what they do, and to be fair, neither did I until I looked them up. And from that point, I kind of got a better understanding of how the world's sort of retailers work, how coupons work, how loyalty works. And I kind of didn't realize how big Eagle Eye was integrated into the rest of the world. I mean, at the point of me joining, it was early days. It was still very early on. And I think in the last coming up to 8 years now, I've been at Eagle Eye to see it grow from where it was when I first joined to where it is now, to the kind of clients that we're dealing with, is insane. It's really, really interesting. But yeah, so I came from an agency background. I went into Eagle Eye, and I think the difference between those kind of two worlds is that you can pour your heart and soul into something that isn't really fundamentally going to change kind of the foundations of what it is. You can pour everything into that. Whereas in an agency world, for those that have worked in agencies, it's very much like getting on a moving train where you have one project that goes on, it lasts 6 weeks, you get off that train, you go on the next one, and you forget about whatever it is that you built 6 weeks ago, and you can't reuse it because it's completely different.
Yeah.
Whereas with this, it's kind of the fundamental foundations of how everything works. And yes, you add new features and you make things work better and you improve them, but you can come to work the next day and go, that thing that I worked really hard on, let's go make it better
Yeah.
and better and better and better.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And for those who may not know, what exactly does Eagle Eye do?
So Eagle Eye is the kind of omni-channel retail service as such. We provide the behind the scenes of all the loyalty platforms that you have probably used without realizing. So clients like Asda, um, Loblaws in Canada, and kind of big retail giants across the world now. We can say that we hold the points. We deal with the campaigns, the coupons, the redemptions. We're integrated at the till, so we are making kind of those decisions in real time. which is quite fun.
Yeah, yeah, I can imagine. One thing that I always like to ask guests of the debrief is like, what is your experience with incident management? I think it's obviously very pertinent given that this is the Incident IO podcast. But yeah, what is your experience with incident management?
I mean, me personally, I've probably run well over, I don't know, 1,000 incidents even, instances of incidents. Um, and I think you learn something in every single one. So
Yeah.
coming from an idea of like, again, in the agency world, when a website goes down and it's been launched to do a particular amount of traffic, let's say, and you've provisioned it in a certain way, and you realized, oh, they've decided to do TV adverts without telling you, and you have to deal with that. So it's things like that, I think, in terms of incident management experience, lots and lots of experience, many hours of it in the day, in the middle of the night, all sorts of issues. I don't think, especially if you run incidents the way that you should run them, you'll never find an incident that was the same as the last one, which makes it even more interesting.
Yeah. And uh, this is a bit off topic, but what is the way, in your opinion, what is the way that you should run them?
That's a great question. I don't think there's an actual answer for this because it will depend on people's perceptions and how they run their company. But
Yeah.
for me, the way that you should run an incident, I know that Google have got a really good idea of this within their kind of SRE handbook,
Mm.
um, and we try and take pieces of that work well. So like the blameless postmortems, the general blameless setup anyway, even when you're running the incident. You get the classic thing from executives coming in asking questions, and you're in it at the moment and you're trying to sort out the issue. You don't necessarily have an answer at that point. I think it's a case of keeping calm, keep almost like a parent to a child that's having a tantrum, right? You have to keep calm. You have to reaffirm how you should behave as such. And I think a lot of others across companies will take that as like an example. If you're a leader and you want to give a good example of how an incident should be run, you kind of want every incident to be like that, so that you kind of, what's the word, like you're kind of sharing that essence of what it is that you want an incident to run like. I think if you're panicking, you're more likely to make mistakes. If you make rash decisions or knee-jerk reactions in the moment, can cause more problems. So I think it's really important to keep a level head, understand what's going on, make data-driven decisions, keep it blameless, and just get to the crux of the issue, mitigate anything that you can, and then work on the bigger pieces either at a later date or kind of take more time to be able to do that, because no one wants to be rushing writing commands on a production environment. That's not fun for anyone. You don't want to be writing a run book in real time. You want to be using the tools that are available to you. So I think that in terms of running an incident, that's kind of the crux of running it. But there's also the fluffy bits around the edges, like what about the post, the debrief, the post mortem, all the rest of it? How do you fit that in? What are the follow up actions? What actions do you need to take now? Like basically, don't forget anything that's happened. I spoke to quite a few people in this space, and they say that all of your incidents can always be predicted
Mhm.
because you have the data.
Yeah.
You always have the data, and for that incident that happened, chances are when you look back, you'll see all of these telltale signs of how it got to that point in the first place. It's just unfortunate that you probably missed them.
Yeah. Yeah, that's actually not the first time that I've heard that. Someone, a previous guest, mentioned the same, that like there's this, I guess, perception that incidents are unpredictable when in many cases you can predict them because, like you said, that there are so many signals that point to things being awry. So staying on top of that can certainly help you prevent them. But one thing that I did want to ask before we move on is You mentioned like staying calm and not panicking. Can you recall an incident that you responded to where you didn't do exactly that, where your response was driven by a bit of panic, and maybe in retrospect you said to yourself, I wish I hadn't responded that way, and maybe like what you learned from that experience?
Yeah, I think I'm trying to think back now. There's been times where you kind of get unexpected results, right?
Yeah.
So one thing that happened to me was we had to run an alter table statement, which was a DDL command. Basically, you could run it in production,
Mhm.
and it shouldn't have any effect on anything at all. So that's all good. According to the documentation on the version that you're running, all happy. And we ran this command, and it basically had an entire database lock and stopped all transactions from running at the database level.
Oh no.
And because you have the documentation in front of you, because you know what's going on, and you're running it, and it causes this issue, obviously you're trying to stop it. And the issue with running things like that is that if you cancel them, it has to go back and undo everything that you've done. So it usually takes longer to undo it than it did to get to the point of where you started, right?
Mhm.
So I think in that situation, I remember not necessarily, I wouldn't say panicking in that sense of pulling my hair out, but was more like I'd known that this was caused by me in running this command, despite being told what it kind of says. It's almost like you've been tricked into running something that you didn't realize it was going to have that effect.
Yeah.
And I think going back to the blameless piece, if you kind of take that mentality for any incident, regardless of who's behind it, I don't think there's any malicious person really, unless it's a security incident, and a bad actor. There's no one in a company that's looking to do something malicious like that. It's not necessarily going to be their fault that they've missed it so much so that they intentionally caused an incident.
Yeah.
So when I've found myself in that position, it's kind of a strange perception because you do want to panic and you want to go, I caused this. Oh no, what can I do? And you're helpless. There's not really a lot you can do. The situation is that it happened, and you now have to kind of change your level of thinking away from panic of oh to it's happened. Let's accept that and move forward with how we get out of this, and then we'll go and do the learnings from it later.
Yeah. Earlier, you touched on, being a part of the growth at Eagle Eye over the last like 8 years or so. I love if you could expand on that a little bit more and like tell me what like you know tell me what it's been like, from that first year to this eighth year now, and some of the things that you've seen, maybe the things that you've experienced, and potentially some of the things that you've learned throughout that period.
Sure. So when I started at Eagle Eye, I think we were building the idea of wallet. So
Yeah.
people that have like a wallet today in their on the phone for their points, their coupons, their accounts, etc. That kind of didn't really exist. So when we were building it, we had no idea what it was going to turn into and
Yeah.
who was going to use it at that point. So at the very beginning, it was kind of like, oh yeah, this sounds cool. This is a brief that we've been given. We'll go and build it. Within the teams. And then over time, as it grew and as more people were using it and as clients had different kind of use cases for it, it's the kind of the classic case, isn't it, of, like if QA try and use it in a particular way, you're like, why are you using that? But we were seeing that from actual clients that were using it on large scale going, okay, that we could make that work. Um, so I think the growth of it has almost it's been quite quick in terms of when you look back, because you don't go, oh, it's been a slog and it's taken ages and it's got to this point.
Yeah.
It's more been like an evolution of you've started with almost like a little seed and you've seen it grow and you've seen it grow. And I guess when you're in it, it's a bit like watching your own hair grow. You don't see it grow at all. You just see yourself in the mirror every day and nothing changes. Whereas people outside looking in going, oh wow, that's turned from this to this. And you're like, oh, has it? I'm not sure that it has, but when you look back, and I think in Eagle Eye at least, we're very we're very harsh on ourselves. We don't necessarily always take a moment to look back and go, wow, look what we've achieved. I
Yeah.
mean, we do, but I would say that we're definitely more forward thinking in terms of like, let's focus on the future rather than look at the past kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I think through the leadership that we had and that we have now has been extremely strong. Our founder, Steve, he is something else. He's got some amazing kind of personality that will keep you going regardless. In fact, I know that when he got me quite quickly because when I was contracting, I had I had my second daughter due to be born, I think in the December, and in the November, he offered me a permanent job, and I was like, oh, that means holiday, and I can have time. You know, it was very clever.
Yeah.
And took him up on that, and I've never really looked back, to be honest.
Yeah.
I know a lot of contractors that do go, oh, I'll always contract or I'll always do this, but I think I really like the idea of what Eagle Eye was doing, where it was going, and we actually had a nice compliment from someone recently saying that the leadership team in Eagle Eye today, usually when you get a lot of tenure, you get people that have been in a company for a while, they usually kind of lose interest or their skills aren't up to scratch.
Yeah.
But that's the complete opposite at Eagle Eye. Everyone that's been in the company long enough is extremely strong in their position. They know a lot about a lot. And the way that we're going and the way that things are heading is really exciting. It's really exciting to see.
Yeah. One thing that I'd love to get your perspective on is like, at the beginning you mentioned that you were sort of as a company entering uncharted territory, and you were basically starting out with this blank canvas to build whatever you guys wanted to. Is that fun or scary or a combination of the two? Because again, there's no precedent, so you can sort of build whatever you want, but there's also no precedent, so you don't know what's right or wrong, I guess, in a sense. But does it matter because there is no precedent? Yeah, just like curious about what your thoughts are there.
Yeah, we had this kind of conversation come up a lot where because there is no kind of example of what it is that we're doing,
Yeah.
a lot of it is kind of guesswork, right?
Yeah.
You get an idea, you write it down, you plan it out, and you go, okay, is this going to work? And sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't. And I guess the difference there is that when it doesn't, you just got to keep moving forward. As they say, you know, keep on going, or
Yeah.
when you're going through hell, keep walking, keep going. And I see a lot of that, particularly around things like best practices and stuff like that, where you've almost got like an idea where people go, oh yeah, this works here. You should do it like this, or this is what's recommended. And you look at that and you go, okay, but I'm not sure that's actually going to work for what we're trying to do,
Hmm.
especially when you kind of reach the peak um, of kind of scale for that particular thing. So, like a good example of that would be like um, a Laravel application, a PHP framework. Within that, it's got a capability to limit the number of, let's say, API requests in a given period. Now, on a small scale, that works really well, but on a much larger scale, to try and kind of horizontally scale that doesn't work anymore. So when you have people going, oh yeah, this is a thing that everyone uses, and it's like, yes, that's lovely. That works really well for like a nice little e-commerce store or some simple APIs behind the scenes. But when you're running billions of transactions, it doesn't quite have the same effect, and you come across very strange issues that you can't Google anymore because there are no answers to go and look for, and you're very much on your own.
Yeah.
And that's kind of a strange position to be in.
Yeah. Yeah. We'll dive into exactly that in just a bit. But okay, so you've been at Eagle Eye for 8 years. Obviously, you've seen quite a bit of growth. What was the point at which you realized that the company was sort of starting to enter more uncharted territory with being unable to like look to precedent as an example? Like, okay, so and so did it this way, so maybe we can replicate that. You've grown past that. Now you're at a stage where you're sort of looking around for answers and you're not finding them anywhere. What was the point at which you realized that that's where you were?
I think when you grow a company, or when you're looking to kind of introduce more things, or you're taking on more clients and more transactions, or whatever it is that you're doing, you kind of feel that growth moving forward with you.
Yeah.
And I think you reach a point where, and the way that I kind of imagine this is that you reach the next chapter, and it's your linear growth then kind of completely stops because you have a big hurdle to get over. And I see that as like a new chapter is starting. And you kind of feel that in some companies, you don't in others. And you kind of reach that point, you go, okay, right. And you look around, you go, okay, what needs to change? And I think at that point was kind of the uncharted territory, because when we reach these chapters, as I see them, when you start looking for answers for those things, whereas before you could look for examples of it, you could search on Google, you could now ask ChatGPT, that works really well for good examples of where it's happened in other companies, or good examples of your mate down the pub have told you about before. But when you start going, okay, I've got this problem, I've not seen this before, and your kind of answers at that point are, oh yeah, I don't really know. Or you start using your quotation marks in Google searches and you get nothing back. And at that point, I think is the uncharted territory, is where the examples of where it's happened no longer exist. So you're kind of just like, oh, okay, are we? And you kind of question yourself. You go, are we doing something fundamentally wrong here,
Yeah.
or are we doing it the right way, or should we be using this out of the box thing, or this best practice to do it this way? And I think the answer is no. It's more intimate than that. I think it's always around what it is that you need to do
Mhm.
as a business to move forward, or as a company, whatever you're trying to achieve, so long as it works, and so long as your customers are happy and you're meeting all kind of the right criteria around that, it's okay to kind of go outside the edges a little bit. It's okay to color outside the box. Um, don't get yourself into trouble. Don't make stupid mistakes that other people have done before, time and time and time again. But when you're kind of challenging yourself, I see that's the fun bit, right? That's the bit where it's a little bit exciting, and you kind of see this at bigger companies, like when Facebook used the equivalent of Vitesse. They started with that, and they realized that they wanted to make their own version of it to deal with. I can't remember what it was exactly, but something to do with disk space. They needed to save on disk space, so they basically made their own fork of Vitesse and did their own thing. And when other companies look at that as an example, they go, well, why would you do that? Why didn't you just use this thing? Or why did you go and reinvent the wheel? And they kind of didn't reinvent the wheel. They just solved a problem that thing had, that thing wasn't going to sort out for them.
Yeah.
And I think it's taking that view. It's not always the right one, and obviously there's examples out there where you can use something else, or you can use a good example of it. But when they start dissipating, you're definitely in uncharted territory. And I see a lot of companies that go through that, and sometimes they take a massive step back when they should be taking a massive step forward.
Yeah. Yeah. We've touched on this a little bit throughout our conversation, but what do you think is the issue with companies looking to other companies that have maybe achieved some of the same objectives before as a model for how they should do things? So I'm company A, company B has a similar goal, similar objectives. Why don't we just do what company B did, or take some inspiration from company B to try to do the same thing? What's the problem with that approach?
Yeah, I see a lot of my friends that have worked in companies like that have taken that approach,
Yeah.
and there are always massive downfalls with that, because they're essentially trying to be someone that they're not. There's a
Hmm.
little bit of like identity crisis,
Yeah.
where and it's the like I get not frustrated, but I put the bee under my bonnet when people use the example of like, oh, Google does this, so why don't we do this?
Yeah.
or Facebook does this, or eBay does this. And it's like, yes, but they are giants in their own right. They go, oh, why don't we scale our department out in this way because this is what this company did. It's like, okay, yes, but they have 9,000 employees. We don't.
Yeah.
So we can't use that as an example. And I think that at every stage of growth that a business finds themselves in will be fundamentally different to the stage of growth that the company that they're comparing themselves with are in. So my advice for people that are looking at that, absolutely take it as inspiration. You can look at what they've done, what works, what doesn't, but ultimately you will find out what works for you by trying it. And if it doesn't work, change it. Don't be afraid to have a play and change things. And if things don't work, change them again and change them again until something works. And a lot of people give up during that process and they end up falling back. And as I said, they take a massive step back instead of having a massive step forward.
Yeah.
So just keep going, keep trying.
Yeah. I can imagine that with that said, you probably feel the same about like best practices because I think it's such a natural thing. Like, what are some best practices for doing X, Y, and Z? People look to that as sort of the answer solution. But I'm guessing you probably think that it's the same thing. Like, but the best practices that may work here may not work over there. They're not universal truths. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, take it with a pinch of salt,
Yeah.
but I think a good example of this actually is those that look for certifications.
Hmm.
So people that get like their Google certs. I mean, I say that I've got two myself, but people that go and get them, I think, take them way too literally for what they are.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing with best practices. They get taken too literally, um, and you find yourself in a position where, okay, this best practice has come out. This is the way that we should do this thing, and only that way. And you might turn around and go, well, that doesn't quite work for us, or we need this thing added on, or because of this situation, that's not the best way of doing it. And those that really want to kind of use best practices will go, no, absolutely not. We should use this way and only this way because this is what's recommended, by the community or by whoever. And I think in some situations, you should challenge that. You should always ask the question is, okay, that's the best practice, that's the recommendation, but does it work for us?
Yeah.
Um, like the like a good get best practice, right, is the principle of least privilege, and that works really, really well for your security setup. I'm not saying that you should go outside of that. And there are other examples like in your WAF rules that it should be a deny by default policy. Now that works really well as well, but in some situations that might not work, right? But it depends. It completely depends on the situation. So I think taking it as like a verbatim, this is the way that you should do things. Yes, that should be the recommendation. That should be your inspiration, and that's how it should work. But there are some cases where you're hindering yourself by trying to fit within that. Try and think outside the box. And I think this is probably more relevant for companies that are struggling with growing, or as we were talking about, when you're kind of reaching those uncharted territories, that's when you have to kind of think outside the box and color outside of the lines. But the ultimate kind of advice on that from me would be challenge yourself, challenge others. You don't have to do anything. You can do whatever you like. If you've got a head on you and you know how to put something together, great. You have a rough idea of the lines that you should stay within, but to get something done or to go further or to scale quicker or anything at all, have a go. Because if you think about it, all of those best practices started off with an idea.
Yeah.
They were never best practices in the beginning. As they say, every good book starts off as a first draft. And I think it's the same thing with this, is that yes, best practices are all the success stories, but they started somewhere.
Yeah. How much would you say that, scaling to this point where there are a lot of unknowns is mostly being comfortable with the idea of failing? Because again, once you're here, there's no roadmap, so to speak. So I can assume that you're probably going to mess up a lot and you're going to fail quite a bit. But I can imagine that that's very scary, especially when you are at this point and the stakes are presumably a little bit higher, so every little mistake that you make is sort of magnified. So yeah, how much do you think just like being comfortable and acknowledging that you are going to fail is part of this conversation?
Yeah, I think it's kind of inherently a thing that's going to happen. It's inevitable. You are going to fail.
Yeah.
No one has every successful person or every successful company never went from success to success to success. They probably had, 1,000 failures in between each one.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But no one posts that on Facebook. No one puts that on their LinkedIn. They only put the success stories. And I think the idea, or at least the kind of the idea of social media today, is all about like the marketing of what's worked.
Yeah.
And I think the human brain isn't really designed to see so much success all the time. So that's how people end up in a kind of a situation where they're feeling a bit down because they're seeing examples outside of their world where it's all successful, but in their world, it's not like that at all. But the reality is that it is. Like you do fail a lot, but that's okay. You just get yourself up and carry on. And I think there's kind of like a little bit of psychology behind that, isn't there? Where
Yeah.
you kind of don't want to focus too much on the bad bits, even though it does happen more often than not. But trying to drive your focus, and I think Steve Jobs and others said this about focus specifically, is that trying to gain your focus or your flow state is really important because you lose it otherwise, and you end up changing your goal, your ultimate goal at the end. That's great. How you get there is up to you. How you get there might change. There might be things that get thrown at you one way or another,
Yeah.
but it doesn't mean that it's a bad thing because you're still aiming for the same thing. You're still going to get there in the end. It's just what does the journey look like?
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So you're at this stage. You've grown. You've scaled. The skies are blue. Everything is working out great. But now you find yourself at this point where, again, you're in uncharted territory. There's no playbook. There's no roadmap. What do you do? Like, do you just get comfortable sort of writing your own playbook? Do you get comfortable sort of setting the tone, being your own lead? Like, what do you do?
You focus on the value.
Yeah.
So when you are kind of looking at something that you roughly want to do, but you don't know how you get there, and as you say, you don't know what the roadmap necessarily looks like. I guess you put some general feelers out and you go, okay, yeah, bear in mind, if you've hired people to be experts in a field that they're in, go and ask them, see what they're going to
Yeah.
recommend, or, do they have an idea? Do they have a great idea for us to go and try? But ultimately, all of that needs to point towards the same thing, which is what value are we getting out of this? What thing are we trying to solve? Let's say I don't know, if you have a downstream event system and that can only deal with a number of requests or a number of messages
Mhm.
per like second, let's say, and you need to 100x that. How would you start by tackling that? One of the things that might come up is, have we considered these serverless technologies, or have we looked at horizontally scaling this part of the platform, or have we looked at a caching mechanism, and all of those kind of things. That's where you start kind of brainstorming ideas,
Yeah.
and you pick pick the ones that you think would be a good one. You give them a go, and you run a proof of concept, and if they work, great, and you crack on, you carry on. I think there's too much of this kind of chat, and in fact, I've drawn this out on a whiteboard so many times to explain this. I know we don't have a whiteboard, but I'll try and explain it with words. Where people start from one point, so they start from where they are today, where they are now,
Yeah.
and they go, okay, we want to get here, like over here somewhere, like really, really far. The ideal state, let's say. I'm trying to think of a good example, but I'll keep it generic. And what happens is everyone talks about the ideal state that might take them 2 years to get to.
Yeah.
And all the time that they're talking about it and they're discussing it, nothing's happening, right? And what you end up with is, rather than making your 10% improvement and getting there slowly, you stay at step one, because you're talking about it. You're going, oh, we should do this, we should do that. We need to completely rewrite the application to go and make it work in this technology over here. And we want to get to that point, and that's kind of the end state. It's like, okay, that's cool, but what can we do tomorrow? Or what can we do this quarter? Can we make a small step in that direction that's going to help get us there?
Yeah.
And usually people don't do that because they're too worried about the end goal. And that's where people fall down, because I've seen this not just in companies I've worked at, but companies that other people have worked at as well, where there's so much chat and talk about the end state, they forget the journey. And that's kind of really fundamental to progress, and it's fundamental to changing how things work and where you want to get to, and all the rest of it. And I think years, literally years, are wasted away because of it. There's too much talk about where you want to go and end up at, rather than how you make that first step. It's always about the first step, because the first step is always the hardest. The second step is easier, and the rest you'll forget about and you'll be there in no time. But it's always that first step that everyone finds so difficult to do, and everyone argues over as well, because that first step, not everyone will agree. That first step might be not big enough for some people and too big for others. And you end up in this position where you don't go anywhere at all. You're still at 3 years later, after you talked about it, about getting to step 10, you're still at step one.
Yeah. Yeah. That resonates with me quite a bit, because during our last episode of the debrief, and I do think that this is somewhat related, I was speaking with this guy Toby over at this company called Future, and we were talking about, within the context of incident management, that people are always aiming for, or some can oftentimes aim for, the perfect fix. So something's gone down, and instead of doing the quick thing that may take like 5 minutes, that gets, let's say, 50% of the people back online, they draw it out, spend an hour, 2 hours, maybe a few hours for that implementing that perfect fix that allows 100% of people to get back online. Where, sure, it's not ideal that only half of the people are online, but at least half of the people are online. So I think there's some parallels there between what you just said, where oftentimes people get caught in this cycle where they're doing a lot of planning and planning and planning, and in that planning they never take that first step to like doing the thing and achieving the goals that they want to achieve. So when you said that, I thought back to his example, because again I think there's some parallels there.
Yeah, a good example of that actually is, I read this online a little while ago, and it made my brain hurt a little bit. Like, now that I know it, which is, if you drive at like 70 miles an hour, in the UK anyway, the time to get to your from A to B is X. If you speed and you do 80 miles an hour, 10%, 10 mile an hour difference, the actual time that you get there is not that much difference in terms of your risk of speeding, everything else. So a lot of it is just a math problem, right? It's a cumulative understanding of how things work. And I think if you take that same logic and you apply it to things like incidents, or things like uptime. I know we've spoken about this before, around like uptime and the number of nines, and what the meaning is of your 8 hours of downtime a year
Yeah.
versus your 47 minutes, whatever it is, downtime a year, and what that 7 hours ultimately means for you and how much it means to you.
Yeah.
It's just a calculation that you have to work out. And the same thing in an incident, you could probably calculate it, right? To say, okay, if we can spend 5 minutes to get 50% of the users back, what does that mean over however long? And as you were just saying, if you spend 3 or 4 hours trying to get the perfect solution, you've wasted 3 hours and 55 minutes of 50% of users. What does that mean in terms of reliability? What does that mean in terms of customer anxiety? What does that mean for your reputation? And I think if you actually look back, and I guess the retro on that one would be a good one, to look back and actually work out how many users would be satisfied if you had taken that step earlier,
Yeah.
what would that mean?
All right, Oliver. Well, thank you so much. Like, I thought this was a fantastic, very insightful conversation. Are there, just to round us out, are there any resources or things that you've worked on that you want to point people to that might be helpful in the context of this conversation?
Yeah, definitely. I did a talk in London a few months ago, a little while ago now, probably. Talking about SRE. So a lot of the fundamental pieces of site reliability engineering, I think, are sometimes forgotten. And hilariously, when we're talking about kind of best practices and other examples of where companies have done this before, such as Google, um, we can take a lot of those learnings and, as we say, use them as inspiration. I think the thing for me that I would like to pass on to others is more of a mindset change.
Hmm.
And that's what my talk was about. So I'd go and recommend anyone to go and watch it. It's available on YouTube. And it's definitely focusing in on the mindset piece, because a lot of it isn't really technical. There are technical things in this role in this industry, sure, but I think where people will succeed is by having the right mindset. It's
Yeah.
always about the mindset. And it's how do you approach a problem? How do you approach an incident? How do you behave in that? How do you set your leadership skills? What are you trying to share with others in your head and in your mind that's going to make a difference? Because everyone can answer the same technical question in the same way. It's just like what's one plus one? It's always going to be two. But how do you interpret that? How do you share that with others? How are you going to behave? I think that's the most important thing throughout all of this is mindset.